The New York sky was brilliant with the August sun. But inside the small supermarket on a Brooklyn street corner, the air was heavy, as if heralding a storm. John Carter, a man in his 40s, stood behind the cash register, his empty gaze fixed on the glass door, his worn-out suit, the few wrinkles on his weary face, and his scarred hands told the story of a turbulent past. His supermarket, a small, dilapidated shop with shelves full of snacks and pet food, was his refuge after the tragedy 5 years ago. His wife, Mary, and their young daughter had died in a mysterious car fire. His son, Alex, vanished without a trace. Since then, John had lived like a shadow, searching for Alex with every clue, no matter how faint the glimmer of hope. Today, the supermarket was busier than usual. A middle-aged man, Brad Pitt, walked in, his voice loud and arrogant. He demanded a 50% discount on his second cup of coffee, complaining about the price in English mixed with a foreign accent. John just nodded, not responding, his eyes cold. Behind him, a young woman, Emma Stone, grumbled a few words about Brad's attitude. "Cheapskate," she muttered, loud enough for Brad to hear. The guy turned around, pointing his finger and cursing. The tension was as taut as a violin string about to snap. John spoke up, his voice low but sharp. "Whoever throws this bastard out gets a 50% discount on coffee." Brad immediately backed away, his face pale, and left quietly. The customers burst into laughter, but John didn't smile. He returned to his work as if nothing had happened. A moment later, the local police officer, Chris Pratt, also known as Fatty, entered with a colleague, Chris, who had been a security guard at the supermarket before his promotion, was always friendly but clumsy. He bumped into an old lady, Helen Mirren, who used to know John's family. The old woman muttered, "If the owner Mary was still alive, she would have fired you long ago." The casual remark was like a knife twisting in John's heart. He stood still, his gaze lost in space, remembering the happy days. 5 years ago, he had bought this supermarket, with its sturdy underground cellar, as a wedding anniversary gift. Mary wasn't pleased, but Alex was thrilled, calling it the secret fortress. Now, that fortress was just a prison for John's grief. Suddenly, a loud explosion echoed from a distance. The supermarket shook, and dust rained down from the ceiling. John immediately ran to the door, his sharp eyes scanning the street. In the distance, black smoke billowed from the port area. Gunshots rang out continuously, mixed with screams. A group of children ran past in a panic. John pulled down the blinds, signaling for everyone to hide behind the shelves. Emma Stone, the girl who had complained earlier, entered silently through the back door, holding an injured child. She looked at John, her eyes full of caution. "They're coming," she whispered. Before John could ask, a group of masked men stormed in, guns in hand. Leading them was Victor Russo, a tall man with a cold face hidden behind a steel mask. He came from Russia, where his criminal organization, known as The Mask, controlled a high-tech smuggling network. Victor looked around, his voice a low growl. "Hand over Emma Stone, and you all get to live." John stood still, his hand tightening around the sledgehammer under the counter. Chris Pratt tried to draw his gun, but a sniper outside shot him in the shoulder, and he fell to the floor. Brad Pitt, the arrogant man from before, screamed in panic and tried to run outside. A bullet went through his head, splattering blood on the glass. John reacted in a flash. He threw the sledgehammer, hitting one of the soldiers in the chest and knocking him over, taking advantage of the chaotic moment. He pulled Emma and the child into the back room. Locking the rolling door, the sound of frantic banging echoed, followed by Victor's voice. 3 minutes. Hand her over, or you all die. Emma, trembling, pressed a small object into John's hand. This is what they want, she said, desperation in her eyes. John opened his hand and saw a tiny electronic chip. Before he could ask, the sound of shattering glass rang out. A giant, known as Iron Skull, burst in, his body as hard as steel, his eyes glowing red. John leaped onto a shelf, bringing the sledgehammer down on Iron Skull's knee with all his might. The monster roared but didn't fall. John realized this creature was not human. He pulled Emma, Chris, and the child down into the cellar beneath the supermarket. The heavy footsteps of Iron Skull echoed from behind, like a death drum. In the darkness, John turned back, his eyes blazing. Stay here. I'll handle this. So, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it where you are? Leave a comment below to let me know you're safe and sound and fully focused on this story. My dear friend, we will continue right after this. The cellar beneath John Carter's supermarket was shrouded in darkness, with only the faint, flickering light of an emergency lamp on the ceiling. The air was musty, a mix of dust and metal. The heavy footsteps of Iron Skull echoed from the stairs, each step like a blow to the hearts of those in hiding. John stood in front of Emma Stone, Chris Pratt, and the child, his hand gripping an iron bar he had picked up from the floor. He signaled for the group to be silent, his sharp eyes scanning the cellar. This wasn't just a hiding place, it had been his wedding anniversary gift to Mary. A solid fortress that Alex used to call his secret castle. Now, it had become a battlefield. Emma held the child tightly, her face pale, but her eyes showing determination. She whispered to John, "They won't stop. This chip, it contains every transaction of the mask for the past 10 years. John nodded, asking no more questions. He knew the tiny object in his pocket was now the key to everything. But first, they needed to survive. Chris, despite his shoulder wound, managed to push himself up, pulling a dagger from his belt. "I won't let them touch the kid," he said, his voice trembling but firm. The sound of clashing metal rang out. Iron Skull appeared at the cellar entrance, his massive body blocking the doorway. He said nothing, merely raising a fist the size of a sledgehammer and smashing a section of the concrete wall. Dust filled the air. John lunged forward, stabbing the iron bar straight into Iron Skull's chest. But it only left a scratch. "He's not human," Emma whispered in terror. John didn't reply, pulling the group deeper into the cellar, where old shelves were piled with boxes and tools. He quickly recognized his advantage. This cellar was his home turf. John had repaired this place hundreds of times. He knew every corner, every conduit. He motioned for Chris to lead Emma and the child behind a steel shelf. While he ran towards an old electrical panel, he yanked a wire, creating a large spark that made Iron Skull flinch. Without hesitation, John grabbed a can of spray paint from a shelf and sprayed it directly into the monster's face, blurring his vision. An enraged roar echoed. But John had already slipped behind him, wrapping a length of steel cable around Iron Skull's neck and pulling it tight. He struggled, thrashing wildly, knocking over a shelf full of paint cans. John seized the opportunity, jumping onto a higher shelf and kicking a heavy metal container down, hitting Iron Skull on the shoulder. The giant fell, but he wasn't down yet. John grabbed another sledgehammer, this time aiming for the knee, the weak spot he had discovered during the fight in the supermarket. A loud crack echoed, and Iron's skull crumpled, showing pain for the first time. John didn't stop, wrapping the cable a few more times, locking the giant's arm to a concrete pillar. "Go!" he yelled at Chris. The group ran towards the end of the cellar, where a secondary exit led to the alley behind the supermarket. But before they could open the door, a loud explosion rang out. A grenade rolled down from the stairs, detonating just a few meters away from them. John pushed Emma and the child behind a wall, while Chris was hit by shrapnel in the leg and collapsed. "Damn it," Chris groaned. Trying to crawl up, John turned back to see 3 more masked soldiers rushing down, submachine guns at the ready. There was no time to think. John grabbed a long steel pipe from the floor, "Espun laikadan, sir," and slammed it into the first soldier's head. He crumpled, his gun clattering away. John leapt forward, snatched the weapon, and fired 2 consecutive shots at the other 2. Blood splattered on the wall. But John didn't stop. He pulled Chris up, signaling for Emma to keep running. "The exit is at the end of the hall," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "Don't look back." They ran through narrow corridors, the footsteps of the masked soldiers echoing from a distance. John paused, checking the chip in his pocket. It was still safe. He looked at Emma, realizing she was more than just a witness. She knew more than she had let on. "Why do they want to kill you?" John asked, his eyes fixed on her. Emma hesitated, then replied, "I used to work for Victor Russo in Russia. I stole this chip from his headquarters in Moscow. It's the evidence to bring down his entire organization." John nodded, asking no more. He knew that from now on, they weren't just running, they were fighting. He led the group to the exit door, but as his hand touched the latch, a beep sounded. A small mine attached to the door flashed a red light. John pushed everyone back, his eyes focused. He took the dagger from Chris's belt and carefully cut the mine's wire, sweat trickling down his forehead. 10 seconds, he muttered, counting down in his head. Just as the mine's light went out, he opened the door and pulled the group out into the alley. Outside, darkness enveloped New York. Police sirens wailed in the distance, but no one was coming to save them. John turned and saw Emma's eyes, a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she said. John just nodded, his gaze fixed on the street, where the dim lights signaled a new hunt. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We're not out of this." The alley behind John Carter's supermarket was pitch black, with only the faint glow of a street lamp illuminating the stained brick walls. The sound of police sirens faded, leaving behind a terrifying silence. John led the way, pulling Emma Stone, Chris Pratt, and the child past dumpsters and puddles of dirty water. The wound on Chris's shoulder was bleeding, but he gritted his teeth and tried to keep up. Emma clutched the child, her eyes scanning their surroundings, as if every shadow hid a threat. John stopped in front of a large manhole cover, prying it open with the iron bar he'd brought from the cellar. "Down here," he commanded, his voice low but firm. They climbed down into the New York sewer system, a labyrinthine network of pipes and concrete corridors. The stench hit their nostrils, but John paid it no mind. He knew these tunnels like the back of his hand. They were once the place where he and Alex explored when the boy was little, calling it their secret kingdom. Now, it was their path to survival. He turned on the flashlight from Chris's phone, its weak beam illuminating the damp walls. "Follow me," John said, leading the group deeper into the darkness. The footsteps of the masked soldiers echoed from behind, growing closer by the second. John stopped, signaling for the group to hide behind a protruding wall. He picked up a sharp piece of metal from a pile of trash and tied it to the end of a plastic pipe, fashioning a crude weapon. "Stay here," he whispered, then slipped into the shadows. Emma held the child's hand tighter. Her eyes filled with worry. "Who is he to be this good?" she asked Chris quietly. Chris, pale from blood loss, just shrugged. "I only know him as the supermarket owner, but he's not normal." John hid around a corner, listening as 3 masked soldiers approached. One carried a submachine gun, while the other 2 had daggers and flashlights. John waited, his breathing as steady as a machine. As the first one passed, he lunged out, driving the plastic pipe into the man's throat. The soldier collapsed without a sound. The other 2 turned, but John had already rolled behind a pipe, dodging a burst of fire from the submachine gun. He grabbed a brick from the floor and threw it hard, smashing one man's flashlight and plunging the area into darkness. Using the moment of chaos, John rushed forward, using the dagger he'd taken from the first soldier to stab the remaining 2 repeatedly. Blood sprayed onto the wall, mixing with the dirty water flowing in the sewer. John returned, pulling the group along. But they hadn't gone far when a small pop echoed from behind. A smoke grenade rolled towards them, releasing a thick cloud of smoke. Emma coughed violently, and the child screamed. John quickly stuffed handkerchiefs in their mouths, signaling them to stay quiet. He lifted another manhole cover, leading them into a smaller branch of the tunnel. "They're forcing us into a dead end," John muttered, a calculating glint in his eyes. He realized Victor Russo didn't just want the chip, he wanted to eliminate all witnesses. In the tunnel, John found an old toolbox, likely left by maintenance workers. He took a roll of steel wire and a bottle of corrosive chemicals, quickly fashioning a simple trap. He tied the wire across the path and poured the chemicals on the floor, creating a slippery puddle. "When I give the signal, run as fast as you can," he told Chris and Emma. They both nodded, though their eyes were still filled with doubt. The footsteps of the masked soldiers echoed again, this time more numerous. John stood waiting, a metal bar in his hand. As the group of soldiers appeared, the one in front tripped on the wire and fell into the chemical puddle. A scream of agony rang out as the chemical ate at his skin. John jumped out, using the metal bar to strike down 2 other men with swift, ghost-like efficiency. But a sniper from a distance opened fire, a bullet grazing John's shoulder. Drawing blood, he gritted his teeth, pulled the group along, and kept running, leaving the trap behind. They stopped at a fork where the tunnel split in 2. Emma was panting, holding the child even tighter. "They won't give up," she said, her voice trembling. John looked at her, then at the child, his expression softening for a moment. "I lost my son to them," he said in a low voice. "I won't let them take anyone else." Chris, despite his pain, managed a weak smile. "You're on, crazy bastard." "John, but I trust you." Suddenly, a whistling sound cut through the air. An arrow shot out from the darkness, embedding itself in Chris's thigh. Hefel, crying out in pain. John turned to see the silhouette of a female assassin, Cherry, standing at the end of the corridor. She held a bow, a cold smile on her face. "Hand over Emma." "Or D," she said, her voice as sharp as a blade. John tightened his grip on the metal bar, his eyes blazing. He knew the real fight had just begun. The darkness of the New York sewer tunnels faded as John Carter led Emma Stone, Chris Pratt, and the child up to the surface through a manhole near the Brooklyn port. The night air was cold, the smell of salt water mixing with smoke from distant explosions. Chris limped, blood from the arrow wound in his thigh leaving a long trail. John scanned the alley, The neon lights from skyscrapers casting patchy glows. The sound of police sirens was still audible. But not close. They were still on their own. Emma held the child, her eyes frantic, but trying to remain calm. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice trembling. John nodded. Pulling the group behind a rusty shipping container, he checked the chip in his pocket, still safe. But before he could make a plan, flashlight beams swept towards them from a distance, accompanied by steady footsteps. The mask had caught up. Leading them was Cherry, the female assassin with fiery red hair. A bow held at the ready, she stood on a low roof, her eyes as sharp as a hunting hawk's. John signaled for Emma and the child to hide behind the container while he pulled Chris into a dark corner. "Grit your teeth," he whispered, tightly bandaging Chris's wound with a piece of cloth torn from his shirt. Chris gritted his teeth and nodded. John picked up a broken piece of steel from a nearby scrap heap. His eyes focused. He knew Cherry wasn't acting alone. From the distance, 3 more masked soldiers appeared, their submachine guns sweeping across the alley. Wasting no time, John charged forward, using the piece of steel as a shield to block the first volley of bullets. He rolled, taking cover behind a dumpster, then threw a brick hard, hitting a soldier's hand and knocking his gun away. John leaped forward, punching him square in the face, causing the soldier to collapse. But Cherry had drawn her bow, and a second arrow shot forward. John leaned aside, the arrow grazing his ear and embedding itself in the container behind him. "Run," he yelled to Emma. Emma pulled the child, running towards a nearby abandoned warehouse. Chris, despite his pain, crawled after them, using a dagger to cut a rope blocking the way. John stayed behind to confront Cherry. She leaped down from the roof, as fast as a panther, drawing a dagger and slashing at him. John dodged, using the piece of steel to block the blade, sending sparks flying. The two struggled, each blow swift and precise. Cherry kicked at John's stomach, but he caught her leg, Ispun, and threw her into a pile of wooden crates. The wood shattered, sending dust everywhere. "You're no ordinary man," Cherry snarled, getting up, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. John didn't answer, his eyes cold. He picked up an iron bar from the wreckage and charged. Cherry shot another arrow, but John rolled out of the way and smashed her bow with the iron bar, breaking it in 2. She drew her knife, slashing repeatedly. But John was faster, locking her arm and twisting her wrist back. Cherry screamed in pain, the knife clattering to the ground. He punched her hard in the face, knocking her out cold. But before he could catch his breath, a loud explosion erupted. A grenade thrown by the masked soldiers caused a corner of the warehouse to collapse. John ran towards Emma and Chris, pulling them inside the warehouse just before smoke and dust enveloped everything. Inside, the space was dark, filled with the smell of machine oil and rotting wood. John checked on the group. The child was panicked but safe. Chris had lost a lot of blood, and his breathing was growing weaker. "He can't go on," Chris whispered. John gripped his shoulder, his voice firm. "You're going to live. I promise." Emma suddenly spoke up, her voice trembling. "Victor Russo won't stop. He's in Russia, but his henchmen are everywhere. This chip, it's not just about money. It's a list of the masked's clients, from governments to criminals." John looked at her, his gaze sharp. "How do you know so much?" Emma lowered her head, whispering, "I used to be his hacker. I betrayed him to get this chip." John didn't ask any more questions. He led the group to a hidden corner of the warehouse, where an escape route led to the Hudson River. But before they could leave, Flashlight beams swept towards them again. Another, larger team of masked soldiers had surrounded the warehouse. John picked up a gun from a dead soldier and checked the ammunition. Only 3 rounds left. "Stay here," he said, then stepped out. His eyes showing no fear. He took cover behind a metal container, fired 2 shots, and took down 2 soldiers. The third one charged. Dagger gleaming. John dodged to the side. Pistol whipped him, then kicked him hard in the chest, sending him falling into the river. But in the distance, Cherry, though wounded, had regained consciousness. She held a pistol, aiming it straight at John. "You here," she roared. John looked at her, his gaze calm. He knew his time was running out, but he had never been one to give up. In the abandoned warehouse, John Carter stood facing Cherry, the female assassin with a pistol aimed straight at his chest. Blood from the wound on his shoulder dripped onto the floor, but John's eyes remained calm, as if death was no threat. Behind him, Emma Stone hugged the child tightly. Hiding behind a metal container, Chris Pratt lay slumped in a corner of the warehouse, his breathing faint. Blood from the wound on his thigh, soaking the wooden floor. Cherry smiled coldly, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Who do you think you are?" "Carter, a hero," she taunted, her voice as sharp as a knife. John didn't reply, his eyes quickly scanning the room. He noticed a rusty oil drum in the corner and a loose electrical wire dangling from the ceiling. A plan flashed in his mind. "You talk too much," he said in a low voice, then suddenly rolled to the side, dodging the bullet from Cherry's gun. The bullet whizzed past, embedding itself in a wooden crate behind him. John jumped up and kicked the oil drum hard, knocking it over and spilling oil across the floor. Cherry fired again, but John was already behind a concrete pillar, using his dagger to cut the electrical wire, creating a spark. A small flame erupted, spreading quickly across the pool of oil. Cherry backed away in panic as the fire blocked her path. John seized the opportunity, lunging forward and striking her wrist hard, making the gun fall. He locked her arm, twisted it back, and kicked her hard in the stomach. Cherry collapsed, passing out amidst the thick smoke. John ran to Emma and the child, pulling them out of the warehouse before the flames consumed everything. He hoisted Chris onto his shoulder. Though every step sent a sharp pain through his own wound, they hid in a small alley near the river, taking cover behind a stack of crates. Emma was panting, her eyes filled with worry. "You're badly hurt." "John, we have to find a doctor." John shook his head, checking on Chris. "He needs a doctor more than I do," he said, his voice hoarse. But before they could move, John suddenly froze, his head spinning. The blood loss was causing him to drift into a daze. Memories flooded back like a violent wave. He saw Mary and Alex in the family car, bright smiles on their faces. It was the day they went on a picnic, 5 years ago. Alex, only 10 years old at the time, was holding the wristwatch John had given him, squealing with delight. But then, the happy image shattered. A huge explosion, the car bursting into flames. John stood helplessly outside. Hearing Mary's and Alex's screams, he rushed into the fire, but only managed to save the charred watch. His wife Mary was gone forever. Alex, his son, the only survivor, disappeared without a trace. John came to, cold sweat running down his forehead. Emma was shaking his shoulder. Her voice panicked John. "Wake up. They're coming." Heavy footsteps echoed from the direction of the river. A team of masked soldiers, controlled by Victor Russo from Russia, was approaching. John gritted his teeth and stood up. Though every movement felt like it was tearing his body apart, he picked up a gun from a dead soldier, Only 2 bullets left. Take the boy. He told Emma. Find somewhere safe. I'll buy some time. Emma hesitated. But John's determined gaze made her nod. She pulled the child and ran towards an abandoned pier. While John helped Chris hide behind a container, he took a bottle of gasoline from a scrap heap, poured it on a nearby pile of rags, and set it on fire. The flames flared up, creating a temporary wall of fire. 3 masked soldiers appeared. Guns ready. John fired 1 shot, taking 1 down. The second bullet hit another in the shoulder, but the third one charged. Dagger gleaming. John dodged aside. Pistol whipped him, then kicked him hard in the chest, sending him falling into the river. But another figure emerged from the shadows, a different giant. Not Iron Skull, but just as powerful, known as Steel Fang. He charged, his sledgehammer-like fist smashing into the container. Denting it, John backed away, looking for a weakness. He realized Steel Fang moved slower than Iron Skull, but his striking power was immense. John leaped onto a crate, used a cable hanging from the ceiling to wrap around Steel Fang's neck, and pulled tight. He struggled, thrashing wildly, but John held on, pulling with all his strength until the monster collapsed. Unconscious, John turned back to find Chris had passed out from blood loss. He checked his pulse. It was weak, but he was still alive. Emma and the child had disappeared into the darkness. Hopefully safe. John sat down, breathing heavily, his gaze fixed on the river. The wristwatch in his pocket ticked, a constant reminder of Alex. You're still out there somewhere, aren't you? He mumbled, his hand tightening around the chip. He knew that to save Emma and find Alex, he had to face Victor Russo, the man behind it all, in his stronghold in Russia. This fight wasn't over. John Carter knelt beside Chris Brett, checking his wound. The bleeding from Chris's thigh had stopped, but he was still unconscious, his face pale. John tied the wound tightly with another piece of cloth, his eyes scanning the alley. Emma Stone and the child were gone, but the heavy footsteps in the distance indicated the masked soldiers were still hunting them. He lifted Chris onto his shoulder and dragged his feet towards an abandoned factory near the Hudson River. New York was cold at night, but in John's heart, the fire of revenge still burned. The old factory, with its rusty machines and severed wires, served as a temporary hideout. John laid Chris on the floor and found a hidden corner to examine the chip in his pocket. The dim light from a dangling bulb illuminated his face, revealing old scars and haunted eyes. He recalled Emma's words. The chip contained a list of clients for the Masked, the criminal organization run by Victor Russo from Russia. But why did Emma have it? And why was Victor willing to kill an entire town to get it back? Light footsteps echoed from the factory entrance. John immediately hid behind a machine, his hand gripping a dagger. Emma entered, holding the child, her eyes panicked but relieved to see John. I thought you were dead, she whispered, placing the child down next to Chris. John stood up, his voice low. Where did you go? I told you to find somewhere safe. Emma lowered her head, took a small USB drive from her pocket, and handed it to John. This is a copy of the data from the chip. I couldn't let them get both. John looked at the USB drive, then at Emma, his gaze sharp. What do you know about the Masked? Tell me the truth. Emma Sayhed sat on the floor and told her story. She was once a talented hacker working for Victor Russo in Moscow. The Masked didn't just smuggle technology, they also manipulated governments, laundered money through cryptocurrency, and trained orphans to become assassins. I was one of them, Emma said, her voice trembling. They took me when I was 10. After my parents died in a bombing orchestrated by Victor. This chip is the key to taking him down. John listened, his hand tightening on the USB drive. He thought about Alex, his missing son. Could the masked have taken him? He didn't ask, but his eyes said it all. Emma continued, I escaped from Russia with the chip, but they found me. Victor wants me dead to silence me. John nodded and stood up. Then we'll have to destroy him first. Suddenly, a loud explosion sounded outside. A smoke grenade was thrown through the window, filling the room with thick white smoke. John pulled Emma and the child behind a machine, signaling them to stay quiet. He picked up a steel bar from the floor, wrapped a rag around one end, and dipped it in nearby machine oil. When a group of masked soldiers stormed in, John lit the steel bar and threw it hard, creating a small explosion as the flame hit an old gas canister. 3 soldiers fell, screaming in pain. But from the smoke and dust, a tall figure emerged. Steel Fang. The monster John had taken down in the alley. He wasn't dead, only wounded. And now he was angrier than ever. John pushed Emma and the child towards the back door, yelling, "Go find the priest at the nearby church." He stayed behind to face Steel Fang. The beast charged, smashing his fist into the floor, shaking the entire factory. John dodged aside and stabbed Steel Fang's thigh with his dagger, but the blade only left a scratch. He's biologically enhanced. John muttered, remembering Iron Skull. He backed away, luring Steel Fang near an old machine with an exposed electrical cable. John leaped onto the machine and kicked an oil drum at the giant, making him slip. He cut the cable, letting the current surge into the pool of oil, electrocuting Steel Fang and knocking him unconscious. John didn't stop, running out the back door to find Emma and the child. They had reached the nearby church, where Father Morgan Freeman was waiting. The old man looked at John, his eyes full of worry. They spare no one. John, I've seen those masked children before. They are no longer human. John nodded, checking on Chris, who was conscious but weak. We need to leave New York, John said, his voice firm. But first, I need answers. Where is Victor Russo? Emma shook her head. He's in Russia, but his henchmen are everywhere. We need to find reinforcements. John looked out the window, the flashing neon lights signaling a new battle. He clutched the chip, thinking of Alex. I will find him, he said, his eyes burning. Even if I have to go all the way to Russia. The old church near the Brooklyn dock stood silently in the night, the light from candles inside the sanctuary casting shadows on its weary stone walls. John Carter stood by a broken window, his sharp gaze sweeping across the dark alley outside. The wind whistling through the broken panes sounded like a warning of approaching danger. Inside, Emma Stone sat beside the child, bandaging the wound of Chris Pratt, who was still weak but conscious. Father Morgan Freeman whispered a prayer, his voice deep and warm but filled with anxiety. John gripped his dagger, feeling the weight of the chip in his pocket. He knew the masked soldiers were closing in, and their time was running out. We can't stay here long, John said, his voice low but decisive. He turned to Emma. You and the boy go with the priest. Find your way to the pier. There's a small boat there. Chris, can you walk? Chris gritted his teeth and nodded, though sweat rolled down his forehead. I'm not leaving you here alone, he said. John didn't answer, only motioning for Morgan to lead the group away. I'll cover our retreat, he said, his eyes fixed on the entrance. As the group moved quietly through the church's back exit, John prepared. He picked up a handgun from a dead masked soldier and checked it. Only 4 bullets left. From a pile of things in the corner of the sanctuary, he grabbed a coil of rope, a can of spray paint, and a few old wooden planks. With the speed of someone accustomed to danger, he tied the rope across the entrance, sprayed the floor to make it slippery, and set the wooden planks as traps. If they want in, they'll pay the price, he muttered. Heavy footsteps echoed from the alley. A squad of about 6 masked soldiers appeared, led by a tall man in a steel mask, known as Iron Claw. He wasn't as strong as Iron Skull or Steel Fang, but his cold eyes and the assault rifle in his hands showed he was dangerous. John hid behind a wall, waiting. As Iron Claw stepped through the door, he tripped on the rope and fell on the slippery floor. John rushed out, firing 2 shots and taking down 2 soldiers behind him. The remaining men opened fire, but John rolled for cover behind the pulpit and threw his dagger, hitting another one in the neck. Iron Claw got up, roared, and fired continuously. John leaped onto the pulpit and kicked over a large candelabra, causing flames to erupt and block the soldier's path. He used the smoke as cover, charged forward, and pistol-whipped Iron Claw, making him stagger. But another soldier slashed with a knife from behind, grazing John's back and drawing blood. He gritted his teeth, spun around, punched the soldier hard in the face, then snatched the knife and stabbed him straight in the chest. Iron Claw seized the opportunity, punching John hard in the chest and sending him crashing into the stone wall. In pain, but John didn't stop. He picked up a shard of broken glass from the floor and threw it, hitting Iron Claw in the eye, causing him to scream and clutch his face. John lunged forward, wrapped a rope around the man's neck, and tightened it until he collapsed. Unconscious, the remaining soldiers panicked. But before they could react, John fired his last 2 bullets, taking down 2 men. The gunshots echoed through the sanctuary, mingling with the ticking of the wristwatch in John's pocket. He touched his pocket, thinking of Alex, his eyes burning with determination. Outsider, Emma, Chris, and the child, led by Morgan, had reached the docks. But as they were about to board a small boat, another masked squad appeared, blocking their way. Emma clutched the child and backed away, while Chris, too weak, tried to draw his knife. Morgan stood protectively in front of them, holding up his crucifix, his voice trembling but firm. "You will not touch them." A soldier sneered and raised his gun. But just then, John emerged from the shadows, charging in like a whirlwind. He punched the soldier hard in the face, snatched his gun, and fired repeatedly, taking down 3 men in the blink of an eye. The others returned fire. But John moved as fast as a phantom, using his dagger and fists to take them down one by one. A sniper fired from a distance, the bullet grazing John's leg. But he didn't stop. He leaped onto a cargo container and threw his knife, hitting the sniper in the neck and sending him tumbling into the river. When they were all down, John gasped for breath, his shirt soaked with blood, but his gaze remained unwavering. Emma ran over to check on John. "You can't keep this up," she said, her voice filled with worry. John just shook his head, his thoughts on Russia, where Victor Russo was waiting. "He has to pay," he said, his voice as low as an oath. Morgan placed a hand on his shoulder, his eyes full of understanding. "What are you searching for?" "John, your son." Or redemption. John didn't answer, merely leading the group onto the boat as the neon lights of New York faded behind them. He knew the battle with the masks had only just begun. The small boat glided across the Hudson River. John Carter stood at the bow, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the city lights flickered like lost stars. The wounds on his shoulder and back were oozing blood, but he paid them no mind. In his pocket, the wristwatch ticked, a constant reminder of Alex. his missing son. And the chip, the very thing that had the entire group being hunted. Emma Stone sat beside the child, her expression worried but resolute. Chris Pratt, despite his makeshift bandages, was still weak. Leaning against the side of the boat, Father Morgan Freeman gripped an oar, his voice low. "We need a safe place." "John, they won't stop hunting us." John nodded, pointing toward an old pier near Lower Manhattan. "There's an abandoned warehouse there. I know the place," he said, his voice firm. But in his heart, he knew Victor Russo's masks from Russia weren't easy to shake. When the boat docked, John helped Chris up and led the group into the warehouse. The air was thick with the smell of salt and machine oil, and rusted shipping containers were stacked like a maze. John checked the entrance, setting a simple tripwire trap with steel wire and a few metal barrels to serve as an alarm. In the darkness, Emma pulled John into a corner, whispering, "There's something I haven't told you. Victor doesn't just want the chip. He wants me dead because I know too much. And there's a child in the organization, a young assassin. They call him Shadow." John froze, his heart pounding. "How old is he?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with suspicion. "Around 15. Why?" John didn't answer. But the image of Alex flashed in his mind. Could Shadow be his son? Before Emma could ask more, a sound came from the entrance. John signaled for the group to hide behind a container. He picked up an iron bar from the floor and moved forward silently. A small figure appeared, wearing a steel mask, moving as swiftly as a phantom. It was Shadow, a dagger in his hand, his cold eyes scanning the warehouse. John hid behind a crate, observing. The boy moved with the precision of a trained assassin, but there was something familiar in his gait. As Shadow turned his head, the light caught a small birthmark on his neck, the same birthmark John remembered on Alex's neck. John's heart felt like it stopped beating. He stepped out, dropping the iron bar, his voice trembling. Alex Shadow froze. But instead of answering, he lunged, his dagger slashing toward John. He dodged, grabbing the boy's wrist and twisting it back. "Stop, it's Dad," John yelled. Shadow wrenched his hand free, his eyes wavering between anger and confusion. "You are not my father," he growled, his voice distorted by the mask. He pulled out a pistol. But John was faster, kicking the gun away and pushing him against a container. "Alex, look at me." John tore open his shirt, revealing an old scar on his chest, a scar Alex had seen as a child. Shadow stopped, the mask hiding his emotions, but his hands trembled. Before John could say more, an explosion erupted. A squad of masked soldiers stormed in, led by Iron Claw, the man John thought he had already taken down. Shadow stepped back, standing beside the soldiers, his eyes still fixed on John. John had no time to think. He dove behind a container, pulling Emma, Chris, and the child toward a back exit, but Iron Claw opened fire, bullets slamming into the wall, kicking up clouds of dust. John spun around, grabbing a gun from a fallen soldier, and fired back, dropping 2 of them. Iron Claw charged, his sledgehammer fists pounding the container, denting it. John rolled away, used his dagger to stab into a gap in Iron Claw's armor, making him roar in pain. He leaped up and kicked him hard in the knee, forcing the giant to fall. But Shadow suddenly attacked from behind, his dagger grazing John's back. He turned, grabbing the boy's hand, his eyes filled with pain. "Don't you remember me?" John asked, his voice choked with emotion. Shadow didn't answer, but his eyes wavered. Another soldier threw a grenade, forcing John to release Shadow and pull the group out the back door. They hid in a secluded corner where Morgan was praying. "He's your son, isn't he?" he asked. John nodded, tears streaming down his face. "But he's not Alex anymore." John led the group to a tunnel leading to the financial district. The footsteps of the masks still echoed behind them. He knew that to save Alex and protect Emma, he had to face Victor Russo in Russia. But first, they needed to survive the night. John clutched the chip, his eyes blazing. "I will bring my son home," he muttered, his voice like an oath in the darkness. On the deserted streets of the financial district, only the wind whistled past the skyscrapers. John Carter led Emma Stone, Chris Pratt, the child, and Father Morgan Freeman into an old warehouse near Wall Street. The vast space, filled with shipping containers and broken machinery, was their last refuge before they could find a way out of the city. John checked the wounds on his shoulder and back. They were still bleeding. But his gaze was unwavering. The image of Shadow, or Alex, his son, still haunted his mind. The boy was now an assassin for the masks, and John knew that to save him, he had to confront Victor Russo's entire organization from Russia. Emma sat beside the child, checking the chip in her pocket. "If we give this to the government, Victor will lose everything," she said, her voice trembling but firm. John nodded, but his eyes were on Chris, who was gasping for air, the wound in his thigh leaving him nearly exhausted. "You have to hang on," John said, retying Chris's bandage. Morgan placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice low. "What are you fighting for? John, your son, or yourself?" John didn't answer, just stood up to check the warehouse entrance. He quickly turned the warehouse into a battlefield. John strung steel wire across the walkways, poured machine oil on the floor, and hid several small gas canisters under the crates. "If they come in, they won't be leaving," he muttered, holding a handgun with 3 remaining bullets. A noise echoed from the distance. The masks had found them. John signaled for the group to hide behind a large container while he stood waiting, his gaze as sharp as a blade. A squad of masked soldiers stormed in, led by Shadow, his steel mask hiding his emotions. But the birthmark on his neck was still visible. John gripped his gun, his heart aching. He didn't want to fight his son, but he had no choice. As the soldiers crossed the tripwire, John yanked a line, causing a heavy wooden crate to fall, crushing 2 of them. A gas canister exploded, and flames erupted, blocking the path of the others. Shadow leaped through the fire, his dagger glinting, and charged straight at John. John dodged to the side, grabbing Shadow's hand, trying to plead, "Alex, stop," but Shadow didn't listen. Kicking John hard in the stomach and forcing him back, he snatched the dagger from the boy's hand but didn't attack, only pushing him against a container. "You are my son," John yelled, his voice choked. Shadow froze, his eyes wavering, but another soldier opened fire. Forcing John to roll away from the bullets, he shot back, taking the soldier down. But Shadow had already vanished into the darkness. Smoke and fire filled the warehouse. John led Emma, Chris, and the child toward the back exit. But a large explosion caused part of the roof to collapse. Morgan pushed the child back, taking a piece of debris to his shoulder and falling. John pulled him up, his eyes resolute. No one gets left behind. They ran through a narrow hallway, but the masks were still in pursuit, led by a new figure, Iron Viper. With a mechanical arm as sharp as a blade, John stopped to face him, signaling for the others to keep running. Iron Viper lunged, his mechanical arm slashing down, splitting a metal barrel in 2. John dodged, picked up an iron bar, and used it to block the blade. The two struggled, Iron Viper's strength forcing John back. He spotted the man's weakness, the joint on the mechanical shoulder. John kicked hard at the joint, making the arm crackle. He leaped up, smashing the iron bar against Iron Viper's head and sending him to the ground. But a bullet from afar grazed John's leg, making him kneel. Shadow reappeared, his gun aimed at his own father. "Alex, you don't have to do this," John said, dropping his weapon and raising his hands. Shadow trembled, his finger wavering on the trigger. Suddenly, a strange sound came from the corner of the warehouse. A toy rabbit rolled out, making a clicking noise. It was John's final trap. As Shadow and the soldiers turned, John triggered a mechanism, causing flour from a crate overhead to pour down, mixing with the fire and creating a massive explosion. In the thick dust, John pulled the group toward the back door, but Chris fell, out of strength. "Go," Chris whispered. John shook his head, helping him up, determined not to leave anyone behind. They hid in a secluded spot near the river, but the footsteps of Shadow and the mask still echoed nearby. John knew the final battle with Victor Russo was approaching. He clutched the chip, his eyes blazing as he thought of Alex. "I will bring my son home," he murmured, preparing for the final confrontation in Russia. The Hudson River flowed silently under the New York night sky. But inside the warehouse near Wall Street, the air was heavy, like the calm before a storm. John Carter, his shirt soaked in blood, stood protectively in front of Emma Stone, the child, and Father Morgan Freeman. Chris Pratt lay collapsed, his breathing faint, unable to move. The masks, under the command of Victor Russo from his stronghold in Russia, had surrounded the warehouse. John clutched the chip in his hand, his eyes blazing as he thought of Alex, or Shadow, his son who was now the enemy's assassin. This was the final battle. Heavy footsteps echoed. Victor Russo, tall and clad in steel armor, walked in, his mask concealing his face, revealing only eyes as cold as ice. Behind him was Shadow, his dagger gleaming, his gaze torn between loyalty to Victor and a faint memory of his father. "Hand over the chip, Carter," Victor boomed, his voice reverberating through the warehouse. "Or everyone dies." John stood tall, fearless. "Today, I end you," he said, his voice as low as a death sentence. Emma clutched the child, backing away, whispering, "John, don't be reckless." But John only looked at Shadow, his eyes filled with pain. He knew that to save his son, he had to confront both Victor and his own past. Victor gave a signal, and a squad of soldiers charged in. John reacted in a flash, leaping onto a container and kicking over a barrel of oil, making the floor slippery. He fired 2 shots from the gun he'd taken, downing 2 soldiers. Shadow lunged, his dagger slashing at him. But John dodged, grabbing the boy's hand and whispering, "Alex, snap out of it." Victor sneered, raising his rifle and firing relentlessly. John rolled behind a container, throwing his dagger and hitting a soldier's hand, making him drop his weapon. He jumped out, punching Victor hard in the face, but the man only staggered, his armor absorbing the blow. Shadow attacked from behind, his dagger grazing John's shoulder and drawing blood. He spun around, locking Shadow's arm and pushing him against a wall. "You are my son," John yelled. Shadow trembled, but Victor commanded, "Kill him." Shadow. In that moment, a beeping sound was heard. Victor pulled out a small device, its screen flashing a 12-second countdown. 12 seconds. "Carter, hand over the chip," or this whole warehouse blows," he said, throwing the device onto the floor. John looked at the screen, his eyes strangely calm. He observed Victor, noticing he was standing next to an old gas canister. Shadow backed away, his eyes wavering. 12, 11. John picked up an iron bar and threw it hard at the gas canister, causing it to leak. 10, 9. He charged forward, kicking Victor into a container and knocking him off balance. 8, 7. John leaped up, using his dagger to stab into a gap in the armor, making Victor roar in pain. 6, 5. Shadow suddenly rushed in, not to attack John, but to push Victor to the floor. "Enough," he yelled, his voice choked. John looked at his son, his heart aching. 4, 3. He picked up the device and threw it hard out the window and into the Hudson River. A distant explosion echoed, sending a spray of water into the air. Victor scrambled up, drew a knife, and slashed at John, but Shadow jumped in front, blocking the blade, blood pouring from his arm. "Dad," Shadow whispered, his mask falling off to reveal the face of Alex, with a familiar birthmark. John lunged, punching Victor hard in the face and knocking him down. He picked up a gun and shot Victor in the leg, causing him to collapse. "You took my son from me," John roared. But before he could fire the final shot, Shadow grabbed his hand and shook his head. "Don't, Dad. I don't want you to become like him." John stopped, tears streaming down his face. He hugged Alex, feeling the warmth of his son for the first time in 5 years. Emma and Morgan pulled the child and Chris out of the warehouse as the police finally arrived. Victor was arrested, but the chip had disappeared. Emma had quietly handed it to a stranger at the pier, someone she believed was a government contact, but his fake smile sent a chill down her spine. John and Alex were taken to the hospital, but Chris didn't make it, leaving John with a new sorrow. Morgan prayed for Chris's soul, while John held Alex's hand, promising to never let him go again. The mask was dismantled, but John knew the shadow of Victor Russo still lingered somewhere, from Russia or beyond. He looked at Alex, his gaze resolute. "We'll start over, son." The film concludes, with John and Alex walking into the New York sunrise, but the chip remained at large, signaling a new threat.